On the night of June 1, 1863, 3 Union gunboats moved up the Combahee River in South Carolina without lights. They had no lights because the woman who planned the mission knew exactly where the Confederate torpedoes were buried in the riverbed. She had spent weeks building an intelligence network of formerly enslaved people along the river. They had given her the locations of every mine, every Confederate picket post, every plantation where enslaved people were ready to run the moment a Union boat appeared on the water. She had drawn the maps herself. She had given them to Colonel James Montgomery, the officer in nominal command of the operation. He followed her directions exactly. Her name was Harriet Tubman. She was 41 years old. She held the title of Spy and Scout for the Union Army. She was the first woman in American history to lead an armed military raid. By the time the sun came up on June 2, 1863, the 3 gunboats had traveled 40 miles up and back on the Combahee River. They had destroyed Confederate rice plantations, granaries, and supply infrastructure critical to the Confederate war effort in South Carolina. And they had brought out 727 formerly enslaved people, men, women, and children, in a single night. 727 people. One night. 0 Union casualties. The operation was reported in the Boston Commonwealth on July 10, 1863. The article named Tubman directly. It described her role in planning the mission. It called her a remarkable woman. It is in the Library of Congress archive today, and it is one of the few times in the official record that what Harriet Tubman actually did for the Union Army was described accurately in print during her lifetime. Everything else was buried in military files for decades. To understand what Tubman did between 1862 and 1865, you have to understand what the Union Army was doing in South Carolina in those years, and why they needed someone the Confederate surveillance apparatus could not see. The Union had occupied the Sea Islands of South Carolina since late 1861. It was a foothold on Confederate territory, a base of operations for the naval blockade, and a staging ground for potential inland operations. But the Union Army in South Carolina had a specific intelligence problem. The Confederate interior was largely unknown to white Union officers. The roads, the waterways, the plantation locations, the Confederate troop positions, all of it was inside territory that a white Union soldier could not enter without being immediately identified and captured. The formerly enslaved people who had escaped to Union lines knew everything. They had worked that land, traveled those roads, carried goods between plantations for years. They knew the terrain the way you know something when your survival has depended on understanding it. What the Union Army lacked was a way to organize that knowledge into actionable military intelligence, and a person who could move between the Union lines and the Confederate interior, recruit sources, evaluate information, and deliver it in a form that military commanders could use. Tubman had already done this for a decade on the Underground Railroad. She had moved through hostile territory, built networks of people who could be trusted, evaluated information about patrol patterns and informants, made decisions under pressure that determined whether people lived or died. She had done it without a salary, without a title, without an institutional structure. She had done it because it was the only tool available to her for accomplishing what she needed to accomplish. When the Union Army asked her to do the same thing in South Carolina in 1862, she understood the assignment immediately. She began building her network within weeks of arriving. She recruited a core group of formerly enslaved men who knew the rivers and the roads. She ran them as sources, not as soldiers, not as laborers, but as intelligence assets. She debriefed them, evaluated their information, identified what was reliable and what was not, and synthesized it into reports that she delivered to Union commanders. General David Hunter, commander of the Department of the South, used her intelligence directly. The correspondence between Hunter's headquarters in Washington mentions the intelligence product without always naming the source, but the military records that have been reconstructed by historians, including Kate Clifford Larson's 2004 biography and Catherine Clinton's research into the War Department files, establish the chain clearly. Tubman ran the network. The network produced the intelligence. The intelligence shaped Union operations in coastal South Carolina. One of her sources was a man named Samuel Haynes. He had been enslaved on a plantation along the Combahee River. He knew the river the way a man knows something when he has worked it every day for 20 years. The currents, the depths, the specific locations where the Confederate engineers had placed their underwater mines. He gave Tubman the coordinates of 2 torpedo placements that Union Navy charts did not have. Without those coordinates, the gunboats could not have proceeded upriver in darkness without hitting one. His name appears in the reconstructed intelligence record. He is not in most accounts of the raid. He was one of the 727 people who came out on the boats that night. She was also conducting her own reconnaissance. She traveled into Confederate territory herself. She moved through a landscape where every white person was a potential enemy and where a black woman traveling alone could be stopped, questioned, or returned to slavery at any moment. She had been doing this since the 1840s. She had learned, over a decade of underground railroad work, how to move without being seen, how to read who could be trusted, how to behave in front of people who would harm her if they understood what she was doing. She applied all of it to military intelligence work. And she did it for the Union Army for 3 years without a formal military commission, without a regular salary, and without the institutional protections that white male officers received as a matter of course. The War Department paid her intermittently. The records show payments for her scouting work. Irregular amounts, not a salary, more like contractor fees. She also sold food she prepared to soldiers to supplement what the Army paid her. A woman running a military intelligence network in hostile Confederate territory was supplementing her income by selling pies and root beer to Union soldiers in her off hours, because the Army had not established a pay structure that covered what she was doing. Now, I want to tell you about the Combahee River raid specifically, because it is the most documented of Tubman's military operations, and because the documentation shows exactly how the Army used her and exactly how it recorded what she did. The raid was planned at the highest levels of Union command in South Carolina. General Hunter authorized it. Colonel Montgomery commanded it. The 3 gunboats, the John Adams, the Harriet A. Weed, and the Sentinel, were U.S. Navy vessels. This was not an informal operation. It was a coordinated military action involving Army and Navy assets, planned over weeks, executed with precision. The intelligence that made it possible, the minefield locations, the patrol schedules, the knowledge of which plantations had people ready to move, came from Tubman's network. Montgomery knew this. Hunter knew this. The operation would have been impossible without it. The Confederate torpedoes in the Combahee River had already damaged Union vessels. Without knowing exactly where they were, the gunboats could not have proceeded upriver at night. The Boston Commonwealth article describes Tubman standing on the deck of one of the gunboats as it moved upriver. It describes her directing the operation in real time, telling Montgomery where to stop, where the torpedoes were, where the people waiting on the banks could be found. It describes the 727 people who came aboard during the night, crowding the decks, some of them carrying what they could grab as they ran. The Confederate commanders in South Carolina filed their own after-action reports. Those reports are also in the archive. They describe the raid with a combination of military assessment and rage. They note the precision of the Union navigation, the fact that the gunboats moved through the minefield without a single detonation. They note that this precision could only have come from inside knowledge of Confederate defenses. They launched an investigation into how their security had been compromised. They were looking for a spy. They were looking in the wrong places because they were not looking for a black woman. The raid was reported. Tubman was named. And then the Army moved on to the next operation, and the next, and the institutional memory of what Harriet Tubman had done began the process of becoming something other than what it was. She continued working for the Union through 1865. She nursed soldiers. She continued scouting. She was present at the fall of Richmond. She was, by any functional definition, a veteran of the Civil War, not as a bystander, not as a support worker, but as an intelligence officer who had planned and participated in military operations that produced direct military results. When the war ended, the Army gave her a certificate of service and sent her home. No pension, no back pay for the 3 years of irregular and unpaid work, no formal recognition of her rank or her role. The woman who had delivered 727 people in a single night and whose intelligence had shaped Union operations in coastal South Carolina for 3 years went home to Auburn, New York, with a piece of paper and the clothes she was wearing. She was 43 years old. She had 38 years left to live, and for 30 of those years she would petition the United States Congress for the pension it owed her. What Congress did with those petitions is the second half of this story. In 1865, Harriet Tubman boarded a train in South Carolina heading north. She had a military pass. She had her certificate of service. She had almost no money. The conductor told her to move to the baggage car, the car for black passengers. She refused. He called for help. Several men grabbed her and threw her into the baggage car, breaking her arm in the process. She was 43 years old. She had just spent 3 years running military intelligence operations for the United States Army. She arrived in Auburn, New York, with a broken arm and no pension. That train ride is documented. It is in her own testimony, in the accounts of people she told, in the record of what happened to a woman who had served her country and was then thrown into a baggage car on the way home. She filed her first pension application with Congress in 1867, 2 years after the war ended. The application described her service, the scouting, the intelligence work, the Combahee River raid. It asked for the pension that the federal government provided to veterans of the Civil War. It was a straightforward request supported by testimony from the Union officers she had served under, including a letter from General Hunter himself confirming her service. Congress did not act on it. She filed again and again. For 30 years, Harriet Tubman submitted pension applications to the United States Congress. 30 years of paperwork, testimony, supporting letters from officers, documentation of specific operations. The applications are in the National Archives. They are complete. They describe in detail what she did and what she was owed. Congress found reasons every time not to act. The reasons changed depending on the year and the political composition of the relevant committee. Sometimes the issue was documentation. The Army had not kept consistent records of her service because she had never held a formal commission. She was paid irregularly, as a contractor, which meant the paper trail was thinner than it would have been for a commissioned officer. This was not her failure. It was the Army's failure to create a pay structure that covered what she was doing. Congress used the Army's administrative failure as a reason to deny the pension of the woman the Army's failure had affected. Sometimes the issue was classification. Tubman had done intelligence work. Intelligence work, by its nature, was not fully documented in public military records. The operations she had planned were not always attributed to her in official after-action reports. Montgomery got credit for the Combahee River raid in the official military record. Tubman was the source who made it possible. The official record did not say that clearly enough for Congress to act on it, which was a direct consequence of how the Army had used her while simultaneously declining to formally recognize her role. The circularity of this was not accidental. She could not get a pension because her service was not fully documented. Her service was not fully documented because the Army had used her in a role it never formally acknowledged. The Army never formally acknowledged the role because formally acknowledging that a black woman was running military intelligence operations would have required confronting the contradiction between what the Army was willing to use and what it was willing to recognize. Congress sat in the middle of this circularity for 30 years and did nothing. What Tubman did during those 30 years is the part of this story that the pension fight overshadows. She went home to Auburn and immediately started the next project. She had purchased a small property before the war. She had no money to maintain it. She fed herself and several family members by farming and selling produce. She took in formerly enslaved people who had nowhere to go. She continued the work she had always done, not because anyone was paying her, but because she had decided that was what she was going to do, and no amount of institutional indifference had ever changed that decision before. She worked with Frederick Douglass, with Susan B. Anthony, with Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She gave speeches about women's suffrage. She was, in the 1870s and 1880s, a figure of national recognition, not a forgotten woman, not invisible. People knew who she was. Newspapers wrote about her. She was invited to speak at events. The recognition did not translate into the pension Congress owed her, but it meant that her applications were not lost in a bureaucratic void. They were denied in full view. In 1886, a man named Franklin Sanborn wrote a formal letter to Congress on Tubman's behalf. Sanborn had known her since the 1850s. He described her service in detail. He attached supporting testimony from officers. He made the case precisely and completely. The relevant congressional committee received the letter, acknowledged it, and took no action. In 1890, Congress passed the Dependent Pension Act, which significantly expanded pension eligibility for Civil War veterans. Tubman applied again. She was denied again on the grounds that she had not served in a capacity covered by the Act. The Act covered soldiers. Tubman had been a scout and spy, a role the Army had used extensively but had never formally classified in a way that triggered pension eligibility. She was 68 years old. In 1897, a senator from Massachusetts named George Frisbee Hoar introduced a private pension bill for Harriet Tubman specifically. Private pension bills were the mechanism Congress used when general pension laws did not cover a specific case, a direct act of Congress to provide for one individual. The bill passed. Tubman began receiving a pension of $8 a month. $8 a month. For running military intelligence operations that had produced 727 freed people in a single night, for 3 years of scouting in Confederate territory, for planning a military raid that the Union Army's official history attributed to the colonel who followed her directions. $8 a month as the wife of Nelson Davis, her second husband, who had died in 1888, not as a veteran, not as a scout, not as the woman who had planned the Combahee River raid. As a widow. The pension she finally received in 1897 was a widow's pension. The United States government paid Harriet Tubman for being married to a man who had served in the Union Army. It did not pay her for what she had done herself. The distinction is in the pension records. It is not subtle. It was a choice. In 1899, a bill was introduced to increase her pension to $25 a month in recognition of her own service. The bill passed. She began receiving $20 a month. The bill was amended downward before passage. The amendment is in the congressional record. Someone decided, in 1899, that Harriet Tubman's military service was worth $20 a month and not $25. That person's decision is preserved exactly as they made it. She used the money to finish building the Harriet Tubman Home for the Aged in Auburn, a facility she'd been working to establish for years to care for elderly Black Americans who had nowhere to go. She donated the property to the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church in 1903. When the home opened, she moved in as a resident. She had given away the building she had spent decades trying to build because the people who needed it more than she needed to own it. She was admitted to the home she had founded in 1911. She was approximately 89 years old. She had been filing pension applications for 44 years. She had received, in total, a fraction of what the law owed a veteran of her service. She died on March 10, 1913. Her last recorded words, spoken to the people gathered around her bed, were, "I go to prepare a place for you." The Auburn community gave her a full military funeral. The local post of the Grand Army of the Republic, the Union Veterans Organization, participated. A year later, a bronze tablet was erected in her honor in Auburn. Booker T. Washington came to speak at the dedication. The War Department did not send a representative. The official military record of the Combahee River raid credits Colonel James Montgomery. Harriet Tubman is mentioned in some accounts, absent from others. The intelligence network she built, the sources she recruited, the maps she drew, the torpedo coordinates she obtained from Samuel Haynes and the others who trusted her with their lives, none of it appears in a single official military document under her name. The Boston Commonwealth article from July 10, 1863 is in the Library of Congress. It names her. It describes what she did. It was written 5 days after the raid by a reporter who spoke to people who were there. The pension records are in the National Archives, 30 years of applications, the supporting letters from officers, the congressional committee acknowledgments, the denials, the widow's pension, the amended bill. All of it is there, in the order it happened, each decision preserved exactly as it was made. She planned the operation. She built the network. She drew the maps. She delivered 727 people in a single night. Congress paid her as a widow. The documents were always there. What was missing was someone willing to read them. The house Harriet Tubman lived in during her Auburn years still stands. The Harriet Tubman Home for the Aged she founded is a National Historic Site. You can visit both. The pension file, all 30 years of it, is in the National Archives in Washington. It is one of the most complete records of institutional failure in the Civil War archive. Every denial is dated, every reason is stated, every officer's supporting letter is attached. The file is thick because she never stopped filing. She filed for 30 years because she understood something about documents that most people do not. A document that exists can be found. A document that exists can be read. A document that exists can eventually be used for what it was always supposed to be used for. She put everything in the file because she knew someone would eventually open it. Subscribe, because next week we open another file.